While I was in the Air Force, the co-pilot on our crew became irritated with another officer in the squadron. The officer with whom my co-pilot was irritated was a Bible-believing Christian who took every opportunity that he could take to testify about Jesus Christ and the salvation found in Him. One day when our crew was together, the co-pilot vented. And he said, if Jeff wants to be a Christian, that's his business. But why does he have to push it on everybody else? And then he paused and he said, why can't he be like Shriver? Shriver's a Christian, but you never hear him talking about it. I suppose my co-pilot meant that to be a compliment, but he had no idea how his comment pierced my heart. The presence of my God, I felt exposed. I felt exposed because my co-pilot was right on two counts. First, I was a Christian. And second, seldom if ever did anyone hear me talking about it. Ashamed of the gospel. That's what I was. And even still in my worst moments, that's what I am. Ashamed of the gospel. Have you ever been there? Is that where you're at today? If so, Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, at least initially, might leave you feeling exposed. Just like my co-pilot left me feeling exposed 30 years ago. Even so, we need to let this passage speak to us. In spite of past failures, we need not be discouraged. In spite of lost opportunities to share, we need not continue to grieve. Like Paul says in the book of Philippians, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead. Let's now let the words of Romans 1, verses 16 and 17 enlighten and empower our own witness that we might glorify God through our proclamation of the good news of Jesus Christ. Now, unlike me and perhaps unlike a few of you, Paul was not embarrassed to stand up and speak for Christ. That's why in Romans chapter 1, verse 15, Paul says, he almost gushes as a matter of fact, I am eager to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome. And then in Romans 1, verses 16 and 17, he tells us why. He writes, verse 16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. Now, before we consider why Paul was not ashamed of the gospel, let's stop and remind ourselves again of exactly what the gospel is. In Romans chapter 1, verses 2 through 5, Paul tells us that this gospel, more literally, this good news that he preaches, is God's exclusive message of salvation first promised to us in the Old Testament by the prophets. Paul goes on in these verses to say that his gospel is a gospel concerning Jesus Christ. Jesus, who became human when he was born in the royal line of David, and who revealed himself to be God's Son with power in His resurrection from the dead. Paul's gospel is a gospel of grace. Grace received by faith. Faith in Jesus. And faith in what Jesus did when He paid our sin penalty when He died on that cross. And it is a gospel that is to be proclaimed to all nations for the glory of God. So here's the question. If that's what Paul tells us, that the gospel is, why wouldn't Paul be excited to preach it? And why wouldn't we be excited to preach it? Why would any one of us here this morning even be tempted to be ashamed of the gospel? I think you know the answer to that question. And so do I. As magnificent as the gospel is to those who have been delivered by it, the vast majority of humanity isn't so enamored with it. In fact, Jesus told us right up front, the world hates Him and the world hates His gospel. And because the world hates Jesus, the world will not go easy on anyone who boldly preaches Christ. But why is that? Why does the world hate God's gospel? Why do people do whatever they can do to make us, as believers, feel ashamed to proclaim it? Well, first, most unbelievers want to shame and silence you and me as Christians, because God's gospel is exclusive in its claims. It's exclusive. In other words, God's gospel rejects any and every notion that all roads lead to heaven. Because only Jesus paid our sin penalty when He died on the cross and when He rose from the grave. Only Jesus can save a lost and a dying world. And that's why in John 14, verse 6, Jesus Himself declares, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. It's why in Matthew chapter 7, Jesus warns, enter through the narrow gate. For the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. Are few. Do we hear what Jesus says? Jesus says, if you want to come to God, there is only one way you can come. And Jesus says that way is through Him. Through Him alone. Jesus says anyone who trusts in their religion, anyone who trusts in themselves, stands condemned and is in fact headed for hell. Is it any wonder then that our world, so proud of its tolerance, will not tolerate Jesus? But not only does the world hate God's gospel because God's gospel is exclusive in its claims. The world hates God's gospel because the gospel exposes our sin. As we move deeper into this book of Romans, we will discover that one of the essential truths of the gospel is the truth that every man, every woman, and every child who has lived, who does live, and whoever will live is a hell-deserving sinner, subject to God's holy and eternal wrath. That's because, like it or not, truth is not relative. Based on His own perfect character, God establishes absolute standards of right and wrong. And the truth is, every one of us violates God's standards in our thoughts, in our words, in our deeds, every hour of every day. Now you know, I think, as well as I do, that is not a popular message in our age of self-esteem. Not a popular message in our age of self-flattery, in an age in which the denial of personal guilt and sin has become a profession. Even so, the reality of our guilt before God is a very critical part of the gospel. And so the question becomes, am I ashamed to preach that? Are you? But there's more. Not only does the world hate the gospel because it's exclusive in its claims and because it in fact exposes our sin, the world hates the true gospel because it forces us to acknowledge our weakness, forces us to acknowledge our inability. You see, in Romans, we will discover that the gospel forces us to confess that we are helpless in light of our sin. The gospel confronts us with the reality that we are incapable of saving ourselves. The gospel declares that we cannot make ourselves worthy of heaven. The gospel declares that we cannot earn God's favor by keeping His law or by doing good works. The gospel declares, in fact, that from beginning to end, salvation is God's work. It's not our work. It's God's. And so the true gospel humbles us by demonstrating that we are totally dependent upon God and His grace for forgiveness and life. It humbles us. And if there's one thing most people in this world hate, it's being humbled. That being the case, it is no wonder that our world considers God's gospel to be absurd and to be foolish. Paul again sums it up for us in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18, where he writes, "For the word of the cross, the message of the cross, is folly. It's foolishness to those who are perishing." And so, Christian, the pressure is on. It's a pressure to be afraid. It's a pressure the world applies to make us ashamed of the very gospel that saves us. They mock, they laugh, they might even defriend us. More than that, the world threatens, it accuses, it abuses, it even murders those who dare open their mouth to preach Christ. How then do we respond? How should we respond? Again, Paul shows us. Listen again, Romans 1, verses 16 and 17. In the face of intense pressure to be ashamed and to be silent, Paul still says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith." In the face of this world's hatred, mockery, and abuse, why did Paul refuse to be ashamed of the gospel? The gospel which is the good news of Jesus Christ. Paul refused to be ashamed of the gospel because Paul says the gospel is God's one and only expression of His power to save. The gospel is God's power to save. Now let's think about what God's power is. God's power is a power that spoke this universe into being. God's power is the power that spread the stars across the sky. It's the power from which your very life and my life springs. God's power is the power by which this world was judged by water in the days of Noah. It's the power by which Sodom was judged by fire. God's power is the same power that parted the Red Sea. God's power is the power that made the sun stand still It's a power that heals the sick. It's a power that raises the dead. God's power is the power by which He works all things together for the good of those who love Him. God's power is the power that is bringing history to its predetermined end. God's power is the power that has and will overcome all rebellion and all sin. And so when Paul says that the gospel is God's power, he's calling us to stand in awe. Because the gospel is God's power, we can be certain that it will bear fruit wherever it is faithfully and persistently proclaimed. It will bear fruit. It's God's power. Because the gospel is God's power, the devil can't stop it. And neither can this world. In fact, it seems that the only thing that keeps the power of God's gospel from transforming lives is your silence and mine. But it's not enough to say that the gospel is God's power and then quit there. Exactly what does the power of God's gospel do? What does God's gospel accomplish whenever it's proclaimed? The answer is salvation. Salvation. Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation. Of course, that raises the question. Salvation from what? Rescue from what? Well, one answer we discover in this book of Romans is that the gospel brings us salvation from sin and from the wrath of God that sin brings. In Romans chapter 3, we will be reminded that we are all sinful and that our sin makes us, by nature, enemies of God. In Romans chapter 6, Paul will also remind us that our sin is actually a form of slavery. Sin puts us in bondage. And without God's gospel power, we can never be set free. Regarding wrath, next week we'll see Romans 1:18, and it will declare that God's wrath is already at work in this world. Even so, in Romans 5:9, Paul will assure us that those who believe in the power of God's gospel, those who believe will be saved from this wrath, God's wrath, that we all so richly deserve. But the power of God's gospel does more than save us from sin and wrath. Also know that God's gospel saves us to a glorious future. A glorious future in a new heaven and a new earth with God Himself. In Romans 8:18, Paul says, thinking about this future, Paul says, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. And then in verses 21 and 24, chapter 8, he continues, the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in pangs of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who are the first fruits of the Spirit, we groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for the adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For Paul says, for in this hope, the hope of the future, we were saved. Saved by the gospel. The salvation God's gospel provides is a salvation from sin, from the wrath that it brings. And it is a salvation to a glorious future with God. Does that salvation, does it belong to you? Does it belong to you? Well, to whom does this great salvation belong? Who gets to experience this gospel power of God's salvation in their personal lives? Again, Paul tells us, Romans 1:16, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone, everywhere, no matter what they believe, as long as they are sincere." Oh, excuse me, that's not what it says. Paul says, the gospel is the power of God for salvation to everyone who specifically believes and obeys the good news about Jesus. To the Jew first, Paul says, and also to the Greek. For the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, "The righteous shall live by faith." Faith, not works. Faith. Do you hear it? The gospel of which Paul refuses to be ashamed isn't about being religious. It isn't about performing ordinances. It isn't about going to a temple building. It isn't about doing good works. God's gospel isn't about belonging to an organization or to some so-called one true church. No, the gospel of which Paul refuses to be ashamed, is a gospel that saves by grace through faith alone. It's a gospel that offers salvation to Jew and Gentile alike. In other words, it's a gospel that doesn't really care if you're white, red, black, Latino, or Asian. It's a gospel for anyone, anywhere. Anyone who believes, no matter who they are, and no matter what they've done. It's a gospel of faith in Jesus Christ, who died on a cross to pay the penalty for our sin, and who rose from the grave to share His life with us. So let me say this one last time. The gospel Paul refuses to be ashamed of is a gospel that rejects self-righteousness. It is a gospel that rejects self-effort. Instead, it's a gospel that demands we receive God's righteousness. Paul says a righteousness that comes from God, to receive that righteousness as a gift. As a gift. And that's why Paul says it's the gospel that is revealed from faith for faith. In other words, it is a gospel. It is a gospel of salvation that is rooted in faith, not works, from beginning to end and everything in between. It is by faith. Salvation by faith in Christ and faith alone. This gospel is the only gospel that saves. This gospel is this world's only hope. This gospel is your only hope. This gospel is my only hope. All other paths leave us lost in our sin. Only Jesus paid our penalty. All other paths leave us condemned and headed for hell. Which makes me wonder, how can I be ashamed of God's gospel? In spite of this world's hatred, what right do I have to be embarrassed by God's power to save? Lord, forgive me. Lord, forgive us. And Lord, make us eager to preach the gospel right here in Utah. Like Paul was so eager to preach the gospel in Rome.